The rusted lock on the barn door rattled as Lillian Matthews fought against the iron shackles binding her to the weathered wooden post. Her tear-stained face illuminated by thin streams of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden slats. At 22, she never imagined her life would come to this, betrayed by her own father and left to suffer in isolation as punishment for defying his wishes to marry the wealthy banker who'd offered to settle her father's mounting debts. Montana Territory, 1878. Summer heat pressed down on the land, baking the soil and turning the air inside the barn into a stifling prison. Lillian had been locked inside for nearly 2 days now, with only a small canteen of water her father had tossed beside her before slamming the heavy wooden door shut. The water was gone now and her throat felt like sandpaper. "I'll return when you've come to your senses," her father had growled, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "Samuel Thornton is a respectable man who can save this ranch. Your mother would have wanted this." Lillian closed her eyes, fighting back fresh tears. Her mother would have wanted no such thing. Caroline Matthews had been a kind, gentle woman who believed in marrying for love, not selling her daughter to the highest bidder. But Caroline had been dead for 3 years now, and in that time, Jacob Matthews had transformed from a hard-working rancher into a gambling, drinking shell of a man. The creak of approaching wagon wheels made Lillian's heart leap. Someone was coming up the long drive to the Matthews ranch house. Gathering what little strength remained, she called out, "Help, please help me." Her voice was weak, barely audible even to her own ears. She doubted anyone could hear her from the main road. The Matthews ranch was isolated, nestled in a valley with the nearest neighbor 5 miles away. Her father had chosen this moment deliberately when the ranch hands were gone for the summer cattle drive. There was no one to witness what he'd done. The sound of the wagon faded, and Lillian slumped against the post. The rope around her wrists had rubbed them raw, and her once clean blue dress was now stained with dirt and sweat. She closed her eyes, trying to conserve her energy. If her father didn't return soon, she feared what might happen. Time passed in a haze. The barn grew hotter as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Lillian drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind conjuring memories of happier times of her mother teaching her to bake bread, of riding her horse across the open plains, of the freedom she once took for granted. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her back to awareness. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside the barn door. Hope flared in her chest. "Hello, is anyone there?" A deep voice called out, not her father's voice. "Yes, in here, please help me." Lillian summoned all her strength to shout, her voice cracking. The footsteps quickened. There was a rattling at the door, then a frustrated grunt. "It's locked," the man said. "Hold on, let me see if I can find something to break it open." "There's a key," Lillian called back. "My father usually keeps it hanging on a nail by the door." Silence, then the sound of searching. "Found it," the voice announced triumphantly. The lock clicked, and sunlight flooded the barn as the door swung open. Lillian squinted against the sudden brightness, unable to make out more than the silhouette of a tall man standing in the doorway. "Good Lord," the man breathed, rushing forward as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior and he spotted her bound to the post. "What happened to you, miss?" As he came closer, Lillian could see him clearly for the first time. He was young, perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges of his hat. His blue eyes were wide with concern as he knelt beside her, already working to untie the ropes. "My father," Lillian explained weakly. "He locked me in here because I refused to marry the man he chose for me." The man's expression darkened as he carefully freed her wrists. "That's no way to treat anyone, especially not your own daughter." His fingers were calloused but gentle as he examined the raw skin of her wrists. "I'm Flynn Callahan. I was passing through on my way to Silverridge when my horse threw a shoe. I came looking for help." "Lillian Matthews," she replied, wincing as she tried to stand. Her legs, cramped from sitting for so long, buckled beneath her. Flynn caught her before she hit the ground, strong arms lifting her as if she weighed nothing. "Easy now," he said. "Let's get you some water and something to eat." My father could return any moment, Lillian warned, glancing nervously toward the door. Then we'd better not be here when he does, Flynn replied firmly. Can you ride? Lillian nodded. I've been riding since I could walk. Good, we'll take your horse along with mine. I need to get to Silverridge and you need to get away from here, he hesitated. Unless you have somewhere else you'd rather go, Lillian thought about her options. Her aunt lived in St. Louis, but that was hundreds of miles away. She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes she wore. I don't, she admitted, but I can't impose on you. Flynn's expression softened. It's no imposition. I can't in good conscience leave you here, and Silverridge is a decent town. We can figure things out from there. He pocketed the key to the barn. I'm keeping this. No one deserves to be locked up like that. He helped her to the water trough, where she drank deeply before splashing her face clean. Her strength was returning gradually, along with her determination. She wouldn't go back to her father, not ever. My horse is in the paddock, she said, pointing toward a chestnut mare grazing nearby. And I need to get some things from the house. Flynn nodded. We'll be quick, your father's not home. No, he probably went into town to drink away what little money we have left, Lillian said bitterly. Together they hurried to the small ranch house. Lillian packed a modest bundle, a change of clothes, a photograph of her mother, and a small box containing her mother's wedding ring and a few pieces of jewelry. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Flynn waited patiently, keeping watch at the window. We should hurry, he said as she emerged from her bedroom. I don't like the idea of running into your father. Lillian nodded, taking one last look around the home where she'd grown up. Despite everything, leaving was harder than she'd expected. This place held memories of her mother of happier times, but those days were gone. They saddled her mare quickly, and Flynn fixed a makeshift shoe on his own horse, enough to get them to Silverridge. As they rode away from the Matthews ranch, Lillian felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was leaving behind everything she'd ever known, riding off with a stranger. Yet somehow she felt safer with Flynn Callahan than she had in her own home for years. Thank you, she said as they crested the first hill, looking back at the ranch growing smaller in the distance. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Flynn glanced at her, the sunlight catching in his blue eyes. Don't thank me yet, Miss Matthews. We've got a long ride ahead of us, and your father might not take kindly to me helping you escape. Lillian, she corrected him. Please call me Lillian. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Lillian it is. They rode in companionable silence, the Montana landscape stretching out before them in rolling hills and wide, open plains. For the first time in years, Lillian felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. She was free. What she didn't know was that Flynn Callahan was about to change her life in ways she couldn't imagine, and that the key to the barn, now tucked safely in his pocket, would become a symbol of something far more significant than a simple escape. The journey to Silverridge would normally take a full day's ride, but with Flynn's horse limping slightly despite the makeshift shoe, they made slower progress. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a summer storm. We should find shelter before that hits, Flynn said, nodding toward the approaching weather. There's a line shack that belongs to the Bar T Ranch not far from here. The owner's a friend of mine. He won't mind if we use it for the night. Lillian hesitated. The propriety of spending a night alone with a man she'd just met wasn't lost on her, but her alternatives were limited. Return to her father, sleep outdoors in a storm, neither option appealed to her. Reading her hesitation, Flynn added, I give you my word as a gentleman, Miss Lillian. You'll be safe with me. There was something in his steady gaze that made her believe him. Lead the way, Mr. Callahan. Flynn, he corrected with a smile. If I'm calling you Lillian, it's only fair. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot, but it was dry and secure. They reached it just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. After stabling the horses in the attached lean-to, Flynn set about starting a fire in the stove while Lillian took inventory of the supplies left in the cabin. There's some coffee, beans, and jerky, she reported. Enough for a decent meal. Flynn nodded appreciatively. You know your way around a kitchen, my mother taught me, Lillian replied, already measuring coffee into a battered pot, before she died. I'm sorry about your mother, Flynn said quietly. Lost mine when I was 14. It changes a person. Lillian glanced at him curiously. There was genuine understanding in his voice, not just sympathy. It does. My father was different before, kinder. Grief affects people in strange ways, Flynn observed, stoking the fire. Some turn mean, some just get lost. And you, Lillian asked, how did it affect you? Flynn was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the growing firelight. Made me restless, I suppose. I've been wandering ever since, never staying in one place too long. Is that why you're headed to Silverridge? He nodded. Heard they need experienced hands at the Collins Ranch. The pay is good, and I could use a steady job for a while. As the coffee brewed and the beans simmered, the cabin filled with homey smells that contrasted with the storm raging outside. Rain lashed against the small window, and thunder rolled across the plains. Lillian felt an unexpected sense of comfort in this tiny shelter, so different from the emptiness that had filled her family home since her mother's passing. They ate side by side at the small table, their conversation flowing more easily as the evening progressed. Flynn told her about his years working ranches across Montana and Wyoming, about the best horse he'd ever broken, about the time he'd narrowly escaped a flash flood in a narrow canyon. In turn, Lillian shared stories of her childhood on the ranch, of learning to read by candlelight, of the dreams she'd once had of traveling to San Francisco or even New York City. Dreams that had died when her mother did, and her father began drinking away their savings. What will you do in Silverridge? Flynn asked as they washed their dishes together, shoulders occasionally brushing in the small space. Lillian had been pondering this very question. Find work, I suppose. I can cook, clean, so perhaps one of the boarding houses needs help. Mrs. Henderson runs the best boarding house in town, Flynn offered. She's a fair employer from what I've heard. I can introduce you when we arrive. That would be kind, Lillian said. Then, unable to help herself, she asked, Why are you helping me? You don't know me. Flynn dried the last plate before answering. I know what it's like to feel trapped, and I know what it's like when no one steps in to help. He met her eyes, and for a moment, Lillian glimpsed something vulnerable behind his confident exterior. Besides, locking someone in a barn against their will isn't right, no matter the reason. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the barn key, holding it up between them. Consider this a promise. You won't be locked up again, not if I have anything to say about it. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, touched something deep inside Lillian. For years, she'd felt increasingly powerless as her father's behavior worsened and their finances crumbled. This small act of defiance, taking the key, helping her escape, represented a turning point. Thank you, she whispered, her fingers briefly touching his as she looked at the key, the moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Finally, Flynn cleared his throat and tucked the key away. You should take the cot, he said. I'll make do on the floor. Lillian started to protest, but he held up a hand. I've slept on worse, believe me. Cattle drives don't exactly offer feather beds, she relented with a smile. Wake me for the second watch, then. I'm no stranger to hard floors either. Deal, Flynn agreed, though they both knew he had no intention of waking her. As Lillian settled onto the narrow cot, pulling a rough blanket around her shoulders, she watched Flynn spread his bedroll near the stove. The rain continued to drum on the roof, creating a soothing rhythm that soon had her eyelids growing heavy. Just before sleep claimed her, she saw Flynn take out the barn key again, turning it thoughtfully in his fingers as he stared into the fire. The last thing she remembered thinking was that she trusted him, this stranger, who had become her unlikely rescuer, more than she'd trusted anyone in years. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world that sparkled in the early morning sunlight. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Flynn moving quietly around the cabin. You didn't wake me, she accused gently, sitting up and smoothing her tangled hair. Flynn glanced over from where he was stoking the fire. You needed the rest. Besides, I'm used to early mornings. They shared a simple breakfast of the remaining beans and coffee before packing up to continue their journey. As they prepared the horses, Lillian noticed Flynn favoring his right leg slightly. "Are you injured?" she asked. He shrugged. "Old wound from the war. Acts up sometimes, especially after sleeping on hard floors." "You fought in the war." Lillian hadn't considered that he might be a veteran. The war between the states had ended 13 years ago, which meant Flynn would have been barely old enough to enlist at its conclusion. "Caught the tail end of it," he confirmed. "Lied about my age to join up. Wasn't my brightest decision, but I was young and foolish." He adjusted the saddle on his horse. "Took a Confederate bullet at Appomattox just days before Lee surrendered. Talk about bad timing." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that impressed Lillian. She was beginning to understand that there was much more to Flynn Callahan than first met the eye. They set off toward Silverridge with the sun at their backs, making better time than the previous day. Flynn's horse was moving more easily, and the roads had dried enough to allow for a comfortable pace. By mid-morning, they could see the town's church steeple in the distance. "We'll be there before noon," Flynn observed. "Best to have a story ready." Lillian looked at him questioningly. "Small towns run on gossip," he explained. "A young woman arriving with a man she's not related to will set tongues wagging. Might be easier if we say I'm your cousin, escorting you to town after a family emergency." The practical suggestion made sense, but for some reason Lillian felt a twinge of disappointment at the idea of pretending Flynn was her relative. "My cousin," she repeated. "Yes, that would be proper." Flynn gave her a sidelong glance. "Unless you'd prefer another story." "No," she said quickly. "Cousins is perfect." They rode the remaining miles to Silverridge, agreeing on the details of their fictitious family connection. As they approached the outskirts of town, Lillian's nervousness returned. She had never been completely on her own before. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. Silverridge was larger than she'd expected a proper town, with a main street lined with businesses, side streets filled with homes, and even a small park at its center. People moved about their daily business, paying little attention to the two riders entering town, which relieved Lillian's concerns about immediate gossip. Flynn led them to a modest stable at the edge of town, where he arranged boarding for their horses. The stable owner, a grizzled older man named Henry, greeted Flynn with recognition. "Callahan, heard you might be heading this way. Colin's been asking after you. They're desperate for good hands up at the ranch." "That's why I'm here," Flynn confirmed, helping Lillian dismount. "Henry, this is my cousin, Miss Lillian Matthews. She's come to seek employment in town." Henry tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam, welcome to Silverridge." After settling the horses, Flynn guided Lillian to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a well-maintained two-story building with a wide front porch adorned with potted flowers. Flynn had barely knocked when the door swung open, revealing a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Flynn Callahan," she said, hands on her hips. "I wondered when you'd drift back this way." Flynn smiled warmly. "Mrs. Henderson, looking lovely as ever." The older woman snorted, but Lillian could see she was pleased by the compliment. "Still full of the same charm and nonsense, I see." Her gaze shifted to Lillian. "And who might this be?" "My cousin Lillian Matthews," Flynn said smoothly. "She's looking for work and a place to stay. I immediately thought of your establishment." Mrs. Henderson studied Lillian with shrewd eyes. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. Clean." "Very well, madam." "Handle difficult customers without losing your temper." Lillian thought of the years dealing with her father's mood swings. "I believe I can, madam." Mrs. Henderson nodded once, decisively. "As it happens, I lost my kitchen girl last week. Ran off with a traveling salesman, foolish child. I could use the help." She stepped aside, gesturing them in. "Come in, both of you. We'll discuss terms over tea." The interior of the boarding house was spotless and comfortably furnished, with a large common room for guests and a dining area that could seat at least 20 people. Delicious smells wafted from the kitchen at the back of the house. Over tea and fresh baked scones, Mrs. Henderson outlined what the position would entail. helping prepare meals for the boarders, cleaning rooms, laundry, and occasionally serving in the dining room. The pay was modest but included a small room of her own and meals. "It's hard work," Mrs. Henderson warned. "I run a respectable house and I expect my girls to behave accordingly. No gentlemen callers in your room, no staying out after dark without permission, and absolutely no spirits on the premises." "I understand completely," Lillian assured her. "I'm not afraid of hard work and I value respectability." Mrs. Henderson seemed satisfied. "You can start tomorrow. I'll show you your room after we finish our tea." She turned to Flynn. "And you, young man, will you be needing a room as well?" Flynn shook his head. "I'll be heading out to the Collins Ranch this afternoon. They're expecting me." A strange sadness settled in Lillian's chest at the reminder that Flynn would soon be leaving. She'd known their paths would diverge once they reached Silverridge, but the reality of it was harder than she'd anticipated. Mrs. Henderson excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, leaving Flynn and Lillian alone for a moment. "Will the ranch be far?" Lillian asked, trying to sound casual. "About an hour's ride," Flynn replied. "Close enough to come into town occasionally." He hesitated, then added, "I could check on you if you'd like. Make sure you're settling in well." Relief washed over her. "I'd like that very much." When Mrs. Henderson returned, she showed Lillian to a small but clean room on the second floor at the end of a hallway lined with similar doors. The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a chair near the window that overlooked the main street. It wasn't luxurious, but to Lillian, who had spent the last few years watching her childhood home deteriorate as her father gambled away their money, it represented a fresh start. "It's perfect," she told Mrs. Henderson sincerely. After the tour, they returned downstairs to find Flynn waiting by the front door, hat in hand. The moment Lillian had been dreading had arrived. "I should head out to the Collins place," he said. "Get settled before nightfall, Mrs. Henderson tactfully busied herself in another room, giving them a moment of privacy. "I don't know how to thank you," Lillian said softly. "You've done so much for me." Flynn's expression was gentle. "You don't need to thank me, just promise you'll be all right here." "I will be," she assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the barn key, pressing it into her hand. "Keep this as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" she asked, closing her fingers around the cool metal. "That you're free now," Flynn said simply. "No one can lock you up again." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Lillian. This key, which had once been the instrument of her imprisonment, was now a symbol of her liberation. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Flynn squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "I'll come by next weekend if that's all right. See how you're faring." "I'd like that," Lillian managed to say. With a tip of his hat and one last smile, Flynn Callahan walked out the door, leaving Lillian standing in the entrance of her new home, the key clutched tightly in her palm, a promise and a possibility all at once. The first week at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house passed in a blur of new routines and faces. Lillian woke before dawn each morning to help prepare breakfast for the 12 current boarders, a mix of shopkeepers, a schoolteacher, a young lawyer, and various other respectable citizens of Silverridge. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Mrs. Henderson proved to be a fair employer if exacting in her standards. "You've got a natural touch with pastry," the older woman commented on Lillian's fourth morning, watching her roll out perfect biscuit dough. "Your mother taught you well." Lillian smiled at the compliment. She believed every woman should know how to run a household properly, whether she had servants or not. "A wise woman," Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Too many girls these days have their heads filled with romantic notions and no practical skills to speak of." By the end of the week, Lillian had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were devoted to breakfast preparation and serving, followed by cleaning the guest rooms. Afternoons involved laundry, mending, and preparing vegetables for dinner. Evenings were the busiest, with dinner service keeping her on her feet until well after dark, but Mrs. Henderson insisted that her girls have Sunday afternoons free for church and contemplation. When Sunday finally arrived, Lillian attended the local church service with Mrs. Henderson and the other kitchen girl, Martha, a shy 16-year-old who had been working at the boarding house for almost a year. The Reverend gave a pleasant, if somewhat long-winded sermon on charity and community, and Lillian found herself glancing around the congregation, wondering if Flynn might be there. He wasn't, and she chided herself for the disappointment that followed this realization. Flynn Callahan was simply a kind man who had helped her in a difficult situation. The fact that his blue eyes and gentle smile kept appearing in her thoughts was merely gratitude, nothing more. After church, Mrs. Henderson gave Lillian and Martha the remainder of the day to themselves. Martha hurried off to visit her parents, who lived on the outskirts of town, while Lillian decided to explore Silverridge properly. The town was bustling even on a Sunday afternoon. Families strolled in the small park, a group of men played horseshoes behind the saloon, and shopkeepers stood in doorways, chatting with neighbors despite their businesses being officially closed for the Sabbath. Lillian walked the length of Main Street, taking in the sights and sounds of her new home. The general store, the milliner's shop, the bank, the sheriff's office, the telegraph office, all the essential businesses of a growing frontier town. At the far end of the street stood the Silver Palace Saloon, its freshly painted facade and large windows setting it apart from some of the more weathered buildings. As she passed, the batwing doors swung open and a familiar figure stepped out onto the boardwalk. Flynn's eyes widened in surprise when he spotted her, and a smile spread across his face. "Lillian," he called, crossing the street to join her. "I was planning to come by the boarding house later today. How are you settling in?" His presence brought an immediate warmth to her chest. "Very well, thank you. Mrs. Henderson has been kind and the work keeps me busy." Flynn fell into step beside her as she continued her walk. "I'm glad to hear it. I worried about you." "You did." Lillian glanced at him, pleased by the admission. "Of course." He gestured toward a bench in front of the barber shop. "Do you mind if we sit for a spell? I'd like to hear how your first week has been." They settled on the bench, a respectable distance apart, though Lillian was acutely aware of his presence beside her. Flynn removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, which curled slightly at the ends. He looked cleaner and more rested than when they'd first met, his jawline freshly shaved, his clothes less trail-worn. "The Collins Ranch is treating you well?" she asked. Flynn nodded. "Mr. Collins is a fair employer. The work is hard, but the pay is good, and the bunkhouse is cleaner than most I've seen." He smiled wryly. "Though I admit, sleeping on the ground with you in that lined shack was more interesting company." The comment brought a blush to Lillian's cheeks, and Flynn immediately looked contrite. "Forgive me, that was forward of me." "No," Lillian said quickly, "it's quite all right." She hesitated, then admitted, "I've thought of that night often. You were very kind to me when I needed kindness most." Flynn's expression softened. It was the least anyone would do. "Not anyone," Lillian corrected quietly. "You." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Flynn cleared his throat. "Have you had any word from your father?" Lillian shook her head. "No, and I don't expect to. He's likely glad to be rid of me, now that I've refused to solve his financial problems by marrying Mr. Thornton." "The man he wanted you to marry?" "Yes. Samuel Thornton owns the bank in Riverside. He's nearly 50, twice widowed, and has a reputation for being difficult." Lillian's mouth twisted slightly. "But he offered to clear my father's gambling debts in exchange for my hand." Flynn's expression darkened. "Your father was willing to sell you to settle his debts." "He didn't see it that way," Lillian said, though she couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "He said he was securing my future, ensuring I'd always have a roof over my head and food on my table." "There are some prices too high to pay for security," Flynn observed. "Exactly what I told him," Lillian agreed, "which is how I ended up locked in the barn." Flynn shook his head in disgust. "I'm not normally one to speak ill of another man, but your father made poor choices." "Yes," Lillian said softly, "he did." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the townsfolk pass by. Several people nodded greetings to Flynn, and he returned them with easy familiarity. "You seem to know many people here," Lillian observed. I've passed through Silverridge a few times over the years, Flynn explained. It's a friendly town for the most part, good people. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you were here last spring. Flynn nodded. I worked at the Collins Ranch for about 3 months before moving on. That's how I knew they might be hiring again. Do you never stay in one place? Lillian asked, curious about his wandering lifestyle. A shadow passed over Flynn's face. Not for long. I guess I've never found a good enough reason to put down roots. Before Lillian could respond, the church bell chimed, signaling the hour. She stood reluctantly. I should head back. Mrs. Henderson expects us for Sunday supper at 5 o'clock. Flynn rose as well, settling his hat back on his head. May I walk you? I'd like that, Lillian replied, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. They strolled back toward the boarding house, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic: the coming harvest festival the town was planning, the quality of the local mercantile's goods, the eccentric old miner who lived on the edge of town and claimed to have found gold in the nearby hills, though no one believed him. When they reached the boarding house, Flynn hesitated on the bottom step of the porch. I wonder if would it be presumptuous to ask if I might call on you properly next Sunday? Perhaps take you for a drive around the countryside if the weather permits. The formal request, delivered with a hint of nervousness that she found endearing, made Lillian's heart beat faster. I would enjoy that very much, she answered, maintaining the same formal tone despite her excitement. Flynn's relief was evident in his smile. Wonderful, I'll speak with Mrs. Henderson about it, make sure she approves. She will, Lillian assured him, then added with a smile, she seems to have a soft spot for you despite her stern manner. Mrs. Henderson has known me since I was a green boy who couldn't tell a heifer from a steer, Flynn admitted. She was friends with my mother back in Wyoming. This new piece of information intrigued Lillian, but before she could ask more, the front door opened and Mrs. Henderson herself appeared. I thought I heard voices, she said, eyeing them with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. Mr. Callahan, are you joining us for supper? Flynn removed his hat respectfully. If it wouldn't be an imposition, madam. Nonsense. There's always room for one more at my table, Mrs. Henderson declared. Come in, both of you. The roast will be ready shortly. As they followed Mrs. Henderson inside, Flynn caught Lillian's eye and winked, a conspiratorial gesture that made her feel like they shared a wonderful secret. Perhaps they did the beginning of something neither had expected when he'd turned that key in the barn door just over a week ago. Sunday supper at Mrs. Henderson's was a lively affair. In addition to the regular boarders, several neighbors had been invited, creating a gathering of nearly 20 people around the extended dining table. Flynn was seated beside Lillian with Mrs. Henderson at the head of the table and the town's doctor, a jovial man named Dr. Wilson, at the foot. Conversation flowed freely, touching on local gossip, national news brought by the latest newspapers, and predictions about the coming winter. Lillian observed that Flynn held his own easily, displaying a natural charm and intelligence that seemed to endear him to everyone present. Even Mrs. Abernathy, the schoolteacher known for her rigorous standards, smiled at his witty observations. You've traveled extensively, Mr. Callahan, Doctor. Wilson commented as the dessert, Lillian's apple pie, was being served. Have you ever considered settling down somewhere permanent? The question caused a brief hush around the table. It was common knowledge that eligible bachelors were in high demand in frontier towns, where men still outnumbered women considerably. Flynn took a careful bite of pie before answering. I suppose I haven't found the right reason to settle yet, Doc. Though I must say, if Miss Matthews keeps baking pies like this, Silverridge might tempt me to reconsider. The table erupted in laughter, and Lillian felt her cheeks grow warm at the compliment. Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing look that only deepened her blush. After dinner, several of the men moved to the front porch to smoke, while the women cleared the table and prepared coffee. As Lillian brought a tray of cups into the parlor where the guests had gathered, she overheard Mrs. Abernathy speaking in low tones to Mrs. Henderson. Seems quite taken with your new girl. Do you think it's serious? It's hardly been a week, Margaret, Mrs. Henderson replied, but I've known Flynn Callahan a long time. He doesn't pay special attention to young ladies without good reason. He has a reputation as a wanderer, Mrs. Abernathy pointed out, not the most stable prospect for a young woman seeking security. Some men wander because they're looking for something, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully. Once they find it, they're the most steadfast of all. Lillian moved away before they could notice her eavesdropping, her mind swirling with the implications of their conversation. Was Flynn truly taken with her, as Mrs. Abernathy suggested? And if so, what did that mean for either of them? When the evening drew to a close, Flynn sought her out as the guests were departing. "Thank you for the pie," he said quietly. "Best I've had since my mother's." "High praise," Lillian replied with a smile. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Flynn glanced around to ensure they weren't being closely observed before continuing. "I spoke with Mrs. Henderson about calling on you next Sunday. She gave her permission, provided we're back before dark and behave with proper decorum at all times." The formal phrasing made Lillian smile. "I look forward to it, as do I." Flynn hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have something for you." He pressed a small object into her palm, a delicate silver charm in the shape of a key attached to a thin leather cord. "I had the blacksmith's son make it," Flynn explained. "He's quite talented with small metalwork. I thought you might like a reminder that's a bit more wearable than the actual key." Lillian stared at the tiny charm, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Would you help me put it on?" Flynn carefully tied the cord around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin in a touch so gentle it made her breath catch. The charm rested just below her throat, a tangible symbol of their unusual beginning. "There," he said, his voice slightly rough. "It suits you." "I'll treasure it," Lillian promised, resisting the urge to touch the charm. "Thank you, Flynn." Their eyes met, and for a moment the busy parlor around them seemed to fade away. The connection between them had grown from gratitude and kindness into something deeper, something with roots that neither had anticipated. The spell was broken by Mrs. Henderson calling for Lillian to help serve the final round of coffee. Flynn stepped back, clearing his throat. "Until next Sunday, then," he said. "Until Sunday," Lillian confirmed, already counting the days. The following week passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Lillian threw herself into her duties at the boarding house with renewed vigor, earning Mrs. Henderson's approval and the respect of the boarders. She learned the rhythms of the house, the preferences of the regular guests, and the most efficient ways to complete her tasks. In her scarce free moments, she explored more of Silverridge, gradually becoming familiar with its streets and inhabitants. The townsfolk were generally welcoming, though Lillian noticed occasional curious glances and whispers. News traveled fast in small communities, and her arrival with Flynn had not gone unnoticed. By the time Sunday arrived, Lillian had heard various versions of her own story circulating through town: that she was Flynn's long-lost cousin, that she was running from an arranged marriage, uncomfortably close to the truth, that she was a wealthy Eastern girl seeking adventure in the West. She let the rumors flow around her, neither confirming nor denying them. After church service, Lillian hurried back to the boarding house to change into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She had just finished pinning her hair when Martha knocked on her door. "Mr. Callahan is here," the younger girl announced, eyes wide with excitement. "He's brought a buggy and everything." Lillian tried to calm the flutter in her chest as she descended the stairs. Flynn stood in the foyer, hat in hand, dressed in clean clothes with his dark hair neatly combed. His face brightened when he saw her, a reaction that sent warmth spreading through her. "Miss Matthews," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Henderson watching from the doorway of her sitting room. "You look lovely today." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," Lillian replied with equal formality, though she couldn't help the smile that curved her lips. "I'm looking forward to our outing." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her expression stern despite the twinkle in her eyes. "Remember, back before dark, Mr. Callahan." "Miss Matthews has responsibilities here." "Yes, madam," Flynn assured her. "I'll have her back in plenty of time." Outside, a neat buggy waited, hitched to a handsome bay horse that wasn't Flynn's usual mount. Seeing her questioning look, Flynn explained, borrowed from Mr. Collins. He was quite insistent when he heard I was taking a lady for a drive. The gesture touched Lillian. Flynn had clearly gone to some trouble to make this outing special. He helped her into the buggy with careful hands, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they set off down the main street, several people called greetings, and Lillian noticed Mrs. Abernathy watching them from the milliner's shop with undisguised interest. "I believe we're providing the town with its Sunday entertainment," she observed wryly. Flynn chuckled. "Small towns thrive on such things. When I was growing up in Laramie, my mother used to say you couldn't sneeze without 3 neighbors offering a handkerchief and 6 more speculating on whether you were coming down with consumption." This mention of his childhood prompted Lillian to ask the questions she'd been curious about. "You don't speak much about your past. Where did you grow up?" Flynn guided the buggy toward the outskirts of town before answering. "Laramie, Wyoming, originally. My father ran a livery stable there until he was killed in an accident when I was 12. After that, my mother took in washing and mending to make ends meet." His expression softened with memory. "She worked herself to the bone for me and my younger sister, Eliza. You have a sister." Lillian hadn't known this. "Where is she now?" "Married to a shopkeeper in Denver," Flynn replied. "Has 2 little ones of her own. I try to visit when I can, though it's been almost a year now." As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of trees. Flynn pointed out local landmarks, a distinctive rock formation said to resemble a sleeping bear, the creek where the town's children swam in summer, the distant mountains that marked the territory's western boundary. Eventually, he guided the buggy to a picturesque spot overlooking a small valley where a creek wound its way through stands of cottonwood trees. Here, he stopped and produced a picnic basket from beneath the seat. "Mrs. Henderson helped me prepare this," he admitted as he spread a blanket on the grass. "I'm afraid my cooking skills are limited to campfire coffee and beans." The basket contained cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of Mrs. Henderson's famous strawberry preserves. There was even a small bottle of lemonade, a luxury in these parts. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Flynn told her about his time in the Army after the war, working as a scout in the Dakota Territory. Lillian shared stories of her mother's attempts to create a proper Eastern household in the wilds of Montana. She insisted on afternoon tea, complete with tiny sandwiches, even when we were living in a 2-room cabin with a dirt floor, Lillian recalled with a smile. "My father thought she was mad, but he indulged her because he loved her so." "She sounds remarkable," Flynn observed. "She was." Lillian's smile faded. "After she died, everything changed. My father started drinking, gambling. It was like losing both parents at once." Flynn reached out hesitantly, covering her hand with his. "I'm sorry, Lillian." The simple touch and sincere words broke something inside her. Before she realized what was happening, tears were streaming down her face, tears she'd held back for 3 long years while trying to be strong, to manage the deteriorating ranch, to handle her father's increasing volatility. Flynn moved closer, offering his handkerchief without a word. When her tears continued, he gently put his arm around her shoulders, providing silent comfort as she finally released the grief and stress she'd been carrying. "I'm sorry," she said eventually, embarrassed by her outburst. "I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Flynn said firmly. "Sometimes tears are necessary." Lillian dabbed at her eyes with his handkerchief, acutely aware of his arm still around her shoulders, warm and reassuring. "You must think me terribly emotional." "I think you're remarkably strong," Flynn corrected. "To endure what you have and still be so kind, so capable." His words, spoken with such conviction, made Lillian look up in surprise. Their faces were close, his blue eyes intent on hers. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, she realized with sudden clarity. Instead, Flynn gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before withdrawing his arm. The moment passed, leaving Lillian with a mixture of disappointment and relief. Things were moving quickly between them, perhaps too quickly for proper courtship. Courtship. The word appeared in her mind unbidden, bringing with it a flutter of excitement and uncertainty. Was that what this was? Did Flynn see their relationship developing in that direction? As if reading her thoughts, Flynn spoke carefully as he repacked the picnic basket. Lillian, I want you to know that my intentions toward you are honorable. I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel— He paused, searching for the right words. I feel drawn to you in a way I can't entirely explain. Lillian's heart quickened. I feel the same, she admitted softly. Flynn's expression brightened. Then, with your permission, I'd like to continue calling on you, properly with Mrs. Henderson's approval, of course. I'd like that very much, Lillian replied, unable to suppress her smile. The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness between them, a shared understanding that something significant had begun. As they passed through the countryside bathed in late afternoon sunlight, Lillian found herself memorizing every detail, the way the light caught in Flynn's hair, the sound of hoofbeats on the packed dirt road, the gentle sway of the buggy, the small silver key resting against her throat. For the first time since her mother's death, Lillian felt hope blossoming in her heart, hope for a future brighter than she had dared to imagine when Flynn had first turned that key in the barn door. As autumn descended on Montana territory, Lillian's life in Silverridge settled into a comfortable pattern. Her work at the boarding house provided stability and purpose, while her growing circle of acquaintances in town helped ease the isolation she had felt on her father's declining ranch. Flynn called on her every Sunday without fail, each visit cementing their connection. They explored the countryside around Silverridge, attended local gatherings, and spent quiet hours in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, talking or reading together while the older woman ostensibly chaperoned, though she often dozed off in her rocking chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. By mid-October, their courtship was common knowledge in Silverridge. Most townsfolk approved of the match, noting the positive change in Flynn Callahan, who seemed less restless, more settled, since Lillian's arrival. The few skeptics who questioned the propriety of their sudden appearance together were silenced by Mrs. Henderson's firm endorsement of the relationship. Flynn Callahan is as honorable a young man as you'll find, she declared firmly at a meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society, effectively ending any lingering gossip. And Lillian Matthews is a credit to proper upbringing. I won't hear another word against either of them. The changing season brought new activities to occupy the town. Harvest festivals, barn raisings, and preparations for the coming winter created a steady stream of community events. Lillian threw herself into these gatherings, baking pies for auctions, helping sew quilts for families in need, and gradually earning her place in Silverridge society. One crisp Saturday in late October, as Lillian was returning from delivering a basket of baked goods to Dr. Wilson's ailing wife, she encountered Sheriff Thomas Baker outside the general store. Miss Matthews, he called, tipping his hat. Got a moment? Lillian approached with a smile. The sheriff was a kind man in his 50s who had always treated her with respect. Of course, Sheriff. How can I help you? Baker's expression turned serious. Had a visitor yesterday asking after you. Man named Jacob Matthews, said he was your father. Lillian's smile vanished and her hand instinctively went to the silver key charm at her throat. Yes, she confirmed after a moment. Jacob Matthews is my father. What did he want? Said he was looking for his daughter who'd run off without a word. The sheriff studied her face carefully, seemed mighty upset about it, mentioned something about you being promised in marriage back home. Cold dread settled in Lillian's stomach. That's not exactly accurate, Sheriff, Baker nodded thoughtfully. Figured as much. Man had whiskey on his breath before noon and his story kept changing. I told him I'd make inquiries, but I didn't confirm you were here. Relief washed over Lillian. Thank you. Mind telling me your side of things? Baker asked gently. Just so I know what I'm dealing with if he comes back. Lillian hesitated, then decided that honesty was her best course. Briefly, she explained how her father had locked her in the barn when she refused to marry Samuel Thornton, and how Flynn had found her and helped her escape. Baker's weathered face darkened as she spoke. Locking someone up against their will is against the law, Miss Matthews, even if it's his own daughter. You're of age. Yes, I'm 22. Then you've every right to live where you choose and marry who you please. The sheriff adjusted his hat. If your father returns, I'll make that very clear to him. I appreciate that, Sheriff, Lillian said sincerely. I have no wish to see him, but I don't want trouble either. Sometimes trouble finds us regardless, Baker observed, but don't you worry. Silverridge takes care of its own, and you're one of us now. The simple statement touched Lillian deeply. In just a few months, this town had become more of a home than her father's ranch had been in years. Did my father say if he was staying in the area? She asked. Baker shook his head. Claimed he was heading back to Riverside today, said he had business to attend to but would return. He patted her shoulder reassuringly. I'll keep an eye out, Miss Matthews, and you might want to let Callahan know about this. I will, Lillian promised. Thank you, Sheriff. As she continued her walk back to the boarding house, Lillian's mind raced with worry. Her father's appearance in Silverridge complicated matters. If he returned, would he try to force her to go with him? And what of Samuel Thornton? Had her father promised her to him so definitively that the banker might consider legal action? These troubling thoughts occupied her for the remainder of the day, distracting her from her duties to the point where Mrs. Henderson finally cornered her in the kitchen. What's bothering you, girl? You've measured the same cup of flour 3 times and still added it to the wrong bowl. Lillian sighed, setting down the measuring cup. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson, I had some unsettling news today. The older woman's expression softened. Sit down. Whatever it is, it'll be easier with a cup of tea and a sympathetic ear. Over steaming cups of chamomile tea, Lillian related her conversation with the sheriff. Mrs. Henderson listened without interruption, her shrewd eyes taking in every detail of Lillian's account. I see, she said when Lillian had finished. And you're worried your father might cause trouble, Lillian nodded. He can be unpredictable when he's been drinking, and if he's truly desperate for Thornton's money. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table to pat Lillian's hand. Listen to me, child, you're not alone anymore. You have friends here, good friends who won't let any harm come to you. I know, Lillian said gratefully. It's just I thought I'd left all this behind. The past has a way of catching up eventually, Mrs. Henderson observed. But that doesn't mean it has to dictate your future. She sipped her tea thoughtfully before adding, Flynn will be in town tomorrow for your usual Sunday outing. Tell him everything. That young man cares deeply for you. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. The observation brought a blush to Lillian's cheeks. Do you think so? Mrs. Henderson snorted. I've known Flynn Callahan since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. That boy has been running from something since his mother died. Grief, responsibility, his own heart, maybe all 3. But he's stopped running since he met you. She fixed Lillian with a penetrating gaze. The question is, how do you feel about him? Put on the spot, Lillian found herself fumbling for words to describe emotions she'd barely admitted to herself. I care for him, deeply. When I'm with him, I feel safe but also alive, like the best version of myself. Sounds like love to me, Mrs. Henderson said matter-of-factly. Love, Lillian repeated softly, testing the word. Was that what this feeling was, this mixture of excitement, comfort, and yearning that filled her whenever Flynn was near? Perhaps it is. Well, don't tell me, Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. Tell him. The following day dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn Sunday. Lillian dressed with special care, choosing a deep green dress that Flynn had once complimented and pinning her hair in a style that softened her features. The silver key charm hung at her throat, as always. Flynn arrived promptly after church, his face lighting up when he saw her, a reaction that never failed to warm her heart. They had planned a simple outing to the lake, a few miles outside town, where the fall colors were said to be particularly magnificent. As they drove through the countryside, Lillian found herself uncharacteristically quiet, trying to decide how to broach the subject of her father's appearance in town. Flynn, sensitive to her mood, eventually broke the silence. Something's troubling you, he observed, not a question but a gentle invitation to confide in him. Lillian nodded, gathering her courage. My father was in Silverridge yesterday, Sheriff Baker told me. Flynn's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained calm. Did you see him? No. The sheriff didn't tell him I was here, but she hesitated. He said my father mentioned returning. I see. Flynn guided the buggy around a bend in the road before asking, what do you want to do if he comes back? The question, so simple yet so respectful of her agency, touched Lillian deeply. Her father had never asked what she wanted. He had dictated, ordered, demanded. Samuel Thornton had treated her as a commodity to be acquired. But Flynn consistently treated her as an equal, capable of making her own decisions. I don't want to see him, she said firmly. I have nothing to say to him, and I don't trust him to respect my wishes. If he's still drinking, Flynn nodded, understanding. Then we'll make sure you don't have to face him alone. Sheriff Baker is a good man, he'll help, and so will I if you'll let me. Thank you, Lillian said softly, relief evident in her voice. Then, gathering her courage, she added, Flynn, there's something else I need to tell you. He glanced at her, concern in his blue eyes. What is it? The words caught in her throat. Mrs. Henderson had made it sound so simple, just tell him you love him. But now, faced with the moment of truth, Lillian found herself afraid. What if she had misread his feelings? What if he didn't feel the same way? Flynn pulled the buggy to a stop at the edge of the lake, turning to face her fully. Lillian, what's wrong? The genuine worry in his expression gave her the courage to continue. Nothing's wrong, it's just… These past months have been the happiest of my life, and it's because of you. Because you found that key and opened the barn door, yes, but more than that, because you've shown me kindness and respect I'd forgotten could exist between a man and a woman. Flynn's expression softened, but he remained silent, letting her finish. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, Lillian continued, her cheeks flushing, is that I've fallen in love with you, Flynn Callahan. For a moment, Flynn sat perfectly still, his blue eyes wide with an emotion Lillian couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, not his usual easy grin, but something deeper, more profound. Lillian Matthews, he said, his voice rough with feeling, I've been in love with you since the moment you looked up at me in that barn, dirty and exhausted, but still so full of courage. He took her hands in his touch gentle. I just didn't know how to tell you or if I had the right to. A wanderer like me with nothing much to offer a woman like you. Joy bubbled up inside Lillian, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. You have everything to offer, she whispered. Everything that matters. Flynn reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, his hand lingering against her skin. May I kiss you, Lillian? He asked softly. In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened, conveying months of growing affection and newly acknowledged love. Flynn's arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and Lillian felt as though she'd finally found her place in the world here, with this man who had quite literally unlocked her future. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. I should probably tell you, he said with a smile in his voice, that I've been carrying something around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it in his closed fist. I had it made from the original, he explained, opening his hand to reveal a gold ring topped with a tiny key design, an exact match to the silver charm she wore. Flynn, Lillian breathed, staring at the ring in wonder. I know it's fast, he said quickly. We've only known each other a few months. If you think we should wait longer, I understand completely. But I know in my heart that you're the woman I want to spend my life with, Lillian. You've given me a reason to stop wandering. Tears of happiness spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she looked from the ring to Flynn's hopeful face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Flynn's answering smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the gold key gleaming in the autumn sunlight, a perfect match to the silver one at her throat. As he pulled her into another kiss, Lillian thought that some locks were meant to be broken, while others, like the one Flynn had just placed around her heart, would last a lifetime. News of Flynn and Lillian's engagement spread through Silverridge with the speed only a small town can achieve. By Monday afternoon, Mrs. Henderson's boarding house had received no fewer than 3 flower arrangements from well-wishers, and a steady stream of visitors dropped by to offer congratulations. "You'd think royalty had announced a wedding," Lillian remarked to Martha as they arranged the latest bouquet in the parlor. The younger girl giggled. "It's the most exciting thing to happen since Mr. Peterson's prize bull got loose and crashed through the mercantile window last spring." Mrs. Henderson, passing through with a tray of refreshments for her current visitors, snorted at the comparison but couldn't hide her pleased expression. She had taken to introducing Lillian as "my girl who's engaged to Flynn Callahan" with unmistakable pride. Flynn himself had ridden back to the Collins Ranch the previous evening, promising to speak with his employer about adjusting his duties to allow for more time in town. They had agreed to a December wedding soon enough to silence any gossips who might suggest impropriety, but allowing sufficient time for modest preparations. "Nothing extravagant," Lillian had insisted when they discussed it. "Just our friends in the church with a celebration afterward." Flynn had readily agreed, adding, "As long as you're there and the preacher says the right words, I don't much care about the details." His easy acceptance had warmed Lillian's heart. After years of her father's controlling behavior, Flynn's willingness to consider her wishes as equal to his own felt like a precious gift. The following Saturday, as Lillian was returning from an errand at the general store, a familiar figure stepped out of the Silver Palace saloon directly into her path. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Despite the weeks that had passed since Sheriff Baker's warning, she had not prepared herself for the reality of coming face to face with her father. Jacob Matthews looked worse than when she'd last seen him. His clothes were rumpled and stained, his face bloated from drink, his eyes bloodshot. He stared at her for a long moment, swaying slightly on his feet. "So it's true," he finally said, his voice rough. "You are here." Lillian straightened her shoulders, determined not to show fear. "Yes, father, I live here now." Jacob's expression hardened. "You ran away, left me without a word." "You locked me in a barn and left me to suffer," Lillian replied evenly. "What did you expect me to do when someone set me free?" Her father's face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful girl, after everything I've done for you, excuse me." A firm voice interrupted as Sheriff Baker appeared beside them, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Is there a problem here, Miss Matthews?" Relief flooded through Lillian. "No problem, Sheriff. My father was just leaving." Jacob glared at the lawman. "This is family business, Sheriff." "Nothing that concerns you." "When it happens on my streets, it concerns me," Baker replied calmly. "Now, Mr. Matthews, I believe your daughter has made it clear she doesn't wish to speak with you. I suggest you respect her wishes." For a tense moment, Lillian thought her father might argue further or even become violent, but something in the sheriff's steady gaze seemed to penetrate his alcohol-fogged mind, and he took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, directing his words to Lillian. "Thornton's still expecting you to honor our agreement. He's not a man who takes kindly to being made a fool of." "There is no agreement," Lillian said firmly. "I never consented to marry him, and you had no right to promise me to anyone." Her father's expression turned ugly. "We'll see about that." "Thornton's got lawyers, powerful friends. You think your new life here is so secure. Just wait." With that parting threat, he turned and stumbled away toward the hotel at the end of the street. Lillian watched him go, her hands trembling despite her outward composure. Sheriff Baker placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You all right, Miss Matthews?" "Yes," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thank you for your intervention, Sheriff. Just doing my job." Baker's kind eyes studied her face. "Your father's staying at the Grand Hotel. Says he has business in town for a few days. Want me to keep an eye on him?" Lillian nodded gratefully. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." The sheriff tipped his hat. "And don't worry too much about his threats. A man like Samuel Thornton may have influence in Riverside, but his reach doesn't extend to Silverridge. You're among friends here." As the sheriff walked away, Lillian took a deep breath to steady herself. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Her father's mention of Thornton's lawyers raised uncomfortable possibilities. Could there be legal repercussions from her flight? Had her father signed some sort of contract on her behalf? Lost in these troubling thoughts, she didn't notice the approach of Mrs. Abernathy until the schoolteacher spoke directly beside her. "Miss Matthews, are you unwell? You look quite pale." Lillian forced a smile. "I'm fine, thank you, Mrs. Abernathy, just a bit tired." The older woman didn't appear convinced but nodded politely. "I wanted to offer my congratulations on your engagement. Mr. Callahan is a fine young man." "Thank you," Lillian replied, grateful for the change of subject. "We're very happy." "I'm sure you are, Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, then added, "If you need anything advice, assistance with wedding preparations, or simply a sympathetic ear, please don't hesitate to call on me. My late husband was a lawyer, and I've retained some knowledge that might be useful to a young woman in your position." The offer, coming from the somewhat reserved schoolteacher, surprised Lillian. "That's very kind of you." Mrs. Abernathy smiled, a rare enough occurrence to be noteworthy. "Us women must look out for one another, especially in these territories where men still make most of the rules." With a nod, she continued on her way, leaving Lillian to wonder if the schoolteacher had overheard more of her confrontation with her father than she'd realized. By the time Flynn arrived the following day for their usual Sunday visit, Lillian had decided to tell him everything about her encounter with her father. They sat together in Mrs. Henderson's back garden, enjoying the last of the autumn sunshine as Lillian recounted the meeting and her father's threats. Flynn listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly concerned. When she finished, he took her hands in his, rubbing his thumbs gently over her knuckles. "I'm sorry you had to face him alone," he said. "I should have been there." Sheriff Baker appeared at just the right moment, Lillian assured him, "but I'm worried about what my father said regarding Mr. Thornton. Could there be some legal claim?" Flynn considered this seriously. "I'm no lawyer, but I don't see how. You're of age, you never signed anything or gave consent. Your father can't simply promise you in marriage without your agreement." Mrs. Abernathy offered her help, Lillian mentioned. "She said her late husband was a lawyer and she might have knowledge that could assist us." "That's unexpectedly kind of her," Flynn remarked. "She always struck me as rather standoffish." "I think there's more to her than meets the eye," Lillian said thoughtfully. "Perhaps we should speak with her tomorrow," Flynn nodded agreement. "In the meantime, I don't like the idea of your father being in town making threats. I've spoken with Mr. Collins and he's agreed to let me stay in town until this situation is resolved." His blue eyes held a fierce protectiveness that made Lillian's heart swell. "I won't let anything happen to you, Lillian. I promise you that." "I know," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "Having you here makes everything better." Flynn turned his head slightly to press a kiss to her palm. "I was thinking," he said, his tone deliberately lighter, "that once we're married, we might consider buying a small property of our own. Not right away, we'll need to save first, but eventually a place where we could build a life together." The change of subject was clearly intended to distract her from worries about her father, and Lillian appreciated the effort. "What sort of place did you have in mind?" "Nothing too grand," Flynn said, his eyes taking on a dreamy quality she hadn't seen before. "Maybe a few acres outside town. Enough for a garden, some chickens, a couple of horses, a comfortable house, nothing fancy but solid, room for children when the time comes." The mention of children brought a blush to Lillian's cheeks, but also a rush of warmth to her heart. "It sounds perfect," she said honestly. "I'd like that very much." They spent the remainder of their visit discussing this future home, sketching imaginary floor plans and debating the merits of different locations around Silverridge. By the time Flynn escorted Lillian back to the boarding house, her earlier anxiety had subsided, replaced by hopeful anticipation of the life they would build together. That evening, as Lillian prepared for bed, she found herself humming softly while brushing her hair, a habit her mother had always encouraged. 100 strokes each night for beautiful hair, Caroline Matthews had insisted. The simple routine reminded her of peaceful evenings in her childhood home, before grief and alcohol had transformed her father into a stranger. A soft knock at her door interrupted these reminiscences. Opening it, she found Mrs. Henderson standing there, an unusual seriousness in her expression. "May I come in for a moment, dear?" Lillian stepped aside, gesturing the older woman into her small room. "Of course, is something wrong?" Mrs. Henderson sighed, settling heavily onto the room's single chair. "I've just had a visitor, your father." Alarm shot through Lillian. "What did he want?" "To speak with you initially," Mrs. Henderson replied. "When I informed him that you were not available and would not be made available to him at any time, he became unpleasant." Her mouth tightened disapprovingly. "I'm afraid the man has forgotten how to address a lady with proper respect." Despite her distress, Lillian couldn't help a small smile at Mrs. Henderson's prim indignation. "I'm sorry you had to deal with his behavior." The older woman waved this away. "I've managed worse than Jacob Matthews in my time, but you should know what he said before I showed him the door." She hesitated. "He claims that you're legally promised to this Samuel Thornton fellow that papers were signed and witnesses present. He says Thornton will be arriving in Silverridge tomorrow to claim what's rightfully his, as your father so delicately put it." Lillian sank onto the edge of her bed, her legs suddenly weak. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "Did your father ever have you sign documents for the ranch, anything he might have misrepresented?" Thinking back, Lillian recalled numerous occasions when her father had asked her to sign papers, tax forms, bank documents, ranch business. She had trusted him, never questioning what she was signing. Could one of those documents have been something else entirely? "I don't know," she admitted, fear creeping into her voice. "He often had me sign things for the ranch, but I never read them carefully." Mrs. Henderson reached over to pat her hand. "Don't panic yet. Even if such a document exists, its validity would be questionable at best. No court would enforce a marriage contract signed under false pretenses. But the scandal, the gossip." Lillian worried aloud. "If Thornton comes here making such claims, it could ruin everything Flynn and I are planning." "Let me tell you something about scandals," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "They only have power if people give them power. This town knows you, Lillian. They've seen your character, your work ethic, your kindness. They won't turn against you because some banker from another town makes outrageous claims." The older woman's confidence was reassuring, but Lillian still felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "What should I do when Thornton arrives?" "Nothing," Mrs. Henderson replied decisively. "You'll go about your business as usual. I'll send word to Flynn first thing in the morning, and I suggest we consult with Mrs. Abernathy as well. Between the three of us, we'll ensure you're never alone and never vulnerable." Lillian nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I don't know what I would have done without your support these past months." The older woman's expression softened. "You remind me of my daughter, you know. She had the same quiet strength, the same determination." A shadow passed over her face. "I lost her to scarlet fever 15 years ago. She would have been about your age now." This was the first time Mrs. Henderson had mentioned having a daughter, and the revelation touched Lillian deeply. "I'm so sorry." "Life goes on," Mrs. Henderson said pragmatically, rising from the chair. "We bear our losses and find new joys." "You've brought joy back to this old house, Lillian, and I won't let anyone take that away, not your father, not this Thornton fellow, not anyone." With that declaration, she bid Lillian good night and departed, leaving Lillian with a strange mixture of apprehension about the coming confrontation and gratitude for the circle of protection that had formed around her in Silverridge. As she resumed brushing her hair, her fingers touched the silver key charm at her throat. From imprisonment to freedom, from isolation to community, from fear to love, her journey had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them with Flynn by her side and friends at her back. The morning dawned gray and cold, with a sharp wind that hinted at the winter to come. Lillian rose early, determined to face the day with dignity despite her apprehension about Samuel Thornton's arrival. She dressed with particular care in her most respectable outfit, a high-necked navy blue dress with subtle white trim, and pinned her hair in a conservative style that emphasized maturity rather than frivolity. Flynn arrived at the boarding house just as breakfast was being served, having received Mrs. Henderson's message about Jacob Matthews' visit. His protective presence was reassuring as Lillian went about her morning duties, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his concern. "I've spoken with Sheriff Baker," he told her quietly as they stood together in the kitchen. "He's aware of the situation and will be keeping an eye out for Thornton's arrival." Lillian nodded gratefully. "Mrs. Abernathy is coming by at 10 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson invited her for tea to discuss the matter. The morning passed with excruciating slowness. Every time the bell above the front door jingled, Lillian tensed, expecting to see her father or Samuel Thornton striding in with demands and accusations. But the visitors were only regular boarders coming and going about their business, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Mrs. Abernathy arrived precisely at 10, dressed in her usual severe black dress, but with an unexpected warmth in her greeting. The three women and Flynn gathered in Mrs. Henderson's private sitting room where they could speak freely without being overheard. "I've given this matter considerable thought," Mrs. Abernathy began after preliminaries were concluded. "Based on what you've told me, I believe any contract your father claims to have would be unenforceable for several reasons." She ticked these off on her fingers with the precision of a classroom lecture. "First, you are of legal age and thus cannot be contracted in marriage without your express consent. Second, if you were deceived about the nature of documents you signed, that constitutes fraud. Third, even if such a contract existed, abandonment such as your father locking you in a barn would provide grounds for nullification." "That's reassuring," Flynn said, his shoulders relaxing slightly, "but Thornton still might try to create difficulties." "Indeed," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Men of his type often rely on intimidation rather than legal standing. They assume that women, particularly young women, will capitulate rather than face public confrontation." "Well, he'll find no capitulation here," Mrs. Henderson declared firmly. "Lillian will stand her ground and we will stand with her." As if summoned by their discussion, the front bell jangled again, followed by raised voices in the entrance hall. Martha appeared at the sitting room door, her young face flushed with anxiety. "Mrs. Henderson, there are two gentlemen asking for Miss Lillian. One says he's Mr. Thornton from Riverside Bank and the other is Miss Lillian's father. They're being quite insistent." Mrs. Henderson rose with regal dignity. "Show them into the front parlor, Martha. Tell them we'll be with them shortly." When the girl had gone, Mrs. Henderson turned to the others. "Well, it seems the moment has arrived. Are we prepared?" Flynn moved to stand beside Lillian, taking her hand in his. "We are." Mrs. Abernathy nodded briskly, gathering her notes. "Remember, Miss Matthews, you have both moral and legal right on your side. Stand firm." With these reassurances, they proceeded to the front parlor. Samuel Thornton was exactly as Lillian remembered from their brief encounters in Riverside, a tall, thin man in his early 50s with cold eyes and an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. He stood near the fireplace, examining the room's furnishings with obvious disdain. Jacob Matthews slouched in an armchair, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday suit, which was wrinkled and slightly too small for his frame. Both men straightened as the group entered. Thornton's gaze fixed immediately on Lillian, a proprietary gleam in his eyes that made her skin crawl. Her father simply looked sullen, avoiding direct eye contact with his daughter. "Miss Matthews," Thornton said, his voice smooth as oil, "I've come a long way to find you. Your father has been most concerned about your impetuous departure from home." Before Lillian could respond, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "This is my establishment, Mr. Thornton, and I'll thank you to state your business plainly. Miss Matthews is under my protection and employment." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My business is straightforward, madam. Miss Matthews and I have a binding agreement of betrothal arranged through her father as is proper. I've come to escort her back to Riverside where we will be married as planned." "There is no agreement," Lillian stated clearly, drawing strength from Flynn's presence beside her. "I never consented to marry you, Mr. Thornton, nor would I ever do so." Thornton's expression hardened. "Your consent was given by your father, who has legal authority in such matters. Moreover, there are signed documents." He reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded paper. "This contract, bearing your signature, confirms our arrangement." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, hand extended. "May I examine this document?" Thornton hesitated, clearly taken aback by her authoritative tone. After a moment, he reluctantly handed over the paper. Mrs. Abernathy adjusted her spectacles and studied it carefully, her expression revealing nothing. "This is not a marriage contract," she finally declared. "It is a property transfer agreement for the Matthews Ranch with Miss Matthews' signature as a witness, not as a principal party." She looked up, fixing Thornton with a stern gaze. "Attempting to misrepresent this document as a betrothal agreement could be considered fraud, Mr. Thornton." Thornton's face flushed with anger. "Jacob assured me—" "My father has been assuring people of many things that aren't true," Lillian interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He gambled away most of our ranch, drank away what remained of our savings, and then tried to solve his financial problems by selling me to you like cattle." Jacob Matthews surged to his feet. "Now see here, girl, sit down, Mr. Matthews." Sheriff Baker's voice cut through the tension as he appeared in the doorway, alerted by Martha at Flynn's earlier request. "I believe we should all remain civil." Thornton composed himself with visible effort. "This is a private family matter, Sheriff. There's no need for law enforcement involvement. When it involves allegations of fraud and forced marriage in my town, it becomes my concern," Baker replied evenly. He turned to Lillian. "Miss Matthews, do you wish to marry this man?" "No, Sheriff, I do not," Lillian stated firmly. "In fact, I am already engaged to Mr. Callahan here, with plans to marry next month." This announcement clearly caught Thornton by surprise. His cold eyes shifted to Flynn, taking in his strong, capable appearance and the protective stance he had assumed beside Lillian. "I see," Thornton said after a moment. "And who exactly are you, sir, to interfere in established arrangements?" Flynn met his gaze steadily. "I'm the man who found Miss Matthews locked in a barn by her father, abandoned without adequate food or water. I'm the man who helped her escape a situation no woman should ever face. And I'm the man she's chosen to marry of her own free will." Jacob Matthews had the grace to look ashamed at this blunt description of his actions, but Thornton merely sniffed dismissively. A dramatic tale, to be sure. However, the fact remains that financial considerations are at stake. Jacob Matthews owes the Riverside Bank a significant sum secured against his property. Our arrangement would have settled those debts. "Your arrangement," Mrs. Abernathy interjected, "was with Mr. Matthews, not his daughter. If he owes you money, that is between the two of you. Miss Matthews cannot be used as currency in your transaction." Thornton's thin lips pressed together in irritation. The law," Sheriff Baker interrupted, "is quite clear on this matter, Mr. Thornton. No one can be forced into marriage against their will, regardless of financial arrangements between other parties." A tense silence followed this statement. Lillian could almost see Thornton recalculating his position, weighing his options in light of the united front before him. Finally, he turned to Jacob Matthews, his expression cold. "It seems your daughter has found powerful friends, Jacob. A pity you couldn't manage your affairs or your family with equal competence." He returned his attention to Lillian. "Miss Matthews, I withdraw my suit." "Clearly, you have made your choice." Relief washed over Lillian, but it was short-lived as Thornton continued, addressing her father. "As for you, Jacob, my patience is at an end. The bank will foreclose on your property immediately. You have 1 week to vacate the premises." Jacob Matthews seemed to deflate, the last of his bluster leaving him. "Samuel, please, we've known each other for years. Surely we can work something out. We had an arrangement. You failed to uphold your end." Thornton's voice was merciless. "The debt comes due." With a curt nod to the room at large, he added, "I'll take my leave now. I have a long journey back to Riverside." As Thornton strode from the room, Sheriff Baker following to ensure his departure, Jacob Matthews remained slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat. Lillian felt a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that Thornton's claim had been dismissed, pity for her father's predicament, and lingering anger at his betrayal. Flynn squeezed her hand gently, silently asking if she was all right. She nodded, then took a deep breath and approached her father. "You'll lose the ranch now," she said quietly. Jacob nodded without looking up. "Not much left to lose, truth be told. Most of it's mortgaged to the bank already." "What will you do?" he shrugged, a gesture so defeated it briefly pierced Lillian's protective anger. For all his faults, this was still the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had taught her to ride, who had loved her mother with consuming devotion. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. "Maybe head west, Oregon maybe, start fresh." Lillian glanced at Flynn, who gave her an encouraging nod, understanding her unspoken question. She turned back to her father. "There's a small cabin on the Collins ranch that needs repairs. Flynn says Mr. Collins has been looking for someone to fix it up in exchange for lodging. It wouldn't be much, but it would give you a place to stay until you decide what's next." Jacob finally looked up, surprise evident in his bloodshot eyes. "You do that, after what I did to you?" "I'm not doing it for you," Lillian said honestly. "I'm doing it for the memory of the father you used to be, and for the mother who would have wanted me to show compassion." Tears welled in Jacob's eyes, and for the first time in years, Lillian glimpsed the man he had been before grief and alcohol had twisted him. "I don't deserve your kindness, Lillian." "No," she agreed simply, "but you have it nonetheless on one condition." "Name it, you get sober," Lillian said firmly. "No more drinking. If you want this chance, you earn it by staying clear-headed and working hard." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'll try." "I can't promise I'll succeed, but I'll try." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Lillian knew that her father's demons wouldn't be easily conquered, that the road ahead would have setbacks and disappointments. But offering this small chance at redemption felt right, not for his sake, but for her own. Forgiveness, she was beginning to understand, freed the forgiver as much as the forgiven. "Then it's settled," Flynn said, stepping forward to shake Jacob's hand. "I'll speak with Mr. Collins today. You can ride out with me tomorrow morning." As the arrangements were finalized and her father prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, Lillian felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The confrontation she had dreaded had come and gone, leaving her standing strong with Flynn beside her and their future clear before them. Later that evening, as she and Flynn walked together in the crisp night air, she expressed this feeling. "I've spent so much time being afraid of my father, of being trapped, of not having choices. Today, for the first time, I felt truly free." Flynn smiled down at her, his blue eyes reflecting the starlight. "You were always free in your heart, Lillian. That's what drew me to you from the beginning. Your spirit couldn't be locked away, no matter what barriers were placed around you." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you in that barn, after the initial shock, I mean?" Lillian shook her head, curious. "I thought, here is a woman who hasn't given up, even when she has every reason to. And then, when you insisted on taking your mother's photograph and jewelry before we left, I thought, here is a woman who values the right things, memories, connections, the treasures that can't be replaced." His voice softened. "I think I started falling in love with you right then, though I didn't recognize it at the time." Touched beyond words, Lillian reached up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "And I fell in love with you when you pocketed that key and told me I wouldn't be locked up again, not if you had anything to say about it." Flynn caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. Our life together will be about freedom, Lillian, the freedom to choose our path, to build our dreams, to love without fear or obligation." "I believe you," Lillian whispered, standing on tiptoe to bring her lips to his. Their kiss, sweet and promising under the vast Montana sky, sealed a covenant between them, not one of ownership or control, but of mutual respect and shared dreams. As Flynn's arms encircled her, Lillian knew with certainty that the key he had found that summer day had unlocked not just a barn door, but the door to a future brighter than she had ever dared to hope for. December arrived with a flurry of snowflakes and wedding preparations. Silverridge embraced the upcoming nuptials with enthusiasm, offering assistance in ways both practical and touching. Mr. Collins, impressed by Flynn's dedication and Lillian's kindness toward her troubled father, gifted the couple with a plot of land on the eastern edge of his property, 5 acres with a small stream running through it, perfect for the home they had dreamed of building. Jacob Matthews, true to his word, had remained sober since moving to the cabin on the Collins ranch. The work of repairing the structure seemed to give him purpose, and while his relationship with Lillian remained cautious, tentative steps toward reconciliation had begun. He would attend the wedding, not to give his daughter away. That honor would go to Mrs. Henderson at Lillian's request, but as a guest, a silent acknowledgement of past wrongs and future possibilities. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow glittering in the winter sunlight like scattered diamonds. Lillian stood before the small mirror in her room at the boarding house, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Mrs. Henderson and Martha had helped her dress in a gown of ivory silk, a generous gift from the Ladies' Aid Society, who had pooled their resources to purchase the fabric, and then worked together to create the simple but elegant design. Her hair was arranged in soft waves, adorned with tiny white flowers from Mrs. Abernathy's conservatory. Around her throat hung the silver key charm, now complemented by a delicate bracelet Flynn had given her as an early wedding present, a silver chain with alternating charms of keys and hearts. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Henderson's entrance, the older woman's eyes immediately filling with tears at the sight of Lillian in her bridal finery. "Oh, my dear girl," she breathed. "You look absolutely beautiful." Lillian smiled, her own eyes misting. "Thank you for everything." "I wouldn't be here today if not for you." Mrs. Henderson waved away the gratitude, though her expression betrayed how deeply it touched her. "Nonsense. You made your own path with a little help along the way." She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from Lillian's sleeve. "Are you ready? The church is full to bursting, and your young man looks about ready to wear a hole in the floor with his pacing." The image of Flynn, nervous and eager, waiting for her at the altar, brought a fresh wave of joy to Lillian's heart. "I'm ready," she confirmed, gathering her simple bouquet of winter greenery and white ribbons. The short walk to the church through the snow-lined streets of Silverridge felt like a dream. Townspeople who hadn't been able to secure places inside the already crowded building lined the path, offering smiles and good wishes. Lillian accepted their greetings with grace, amazed at how completely this community had embraced her in the few months since her arrival. At the church steps, Mrs. Henderson adjusted Lillian's shawl one last time. "Remember what I told you," she said softly. "Marriage is a partnership of equals, never less than that." "I'll remember," Lillian promised, squeezing the older woman's hand. The church doors opened, and the gathered congregation turned as one to watch Lillian's entrance. But Lillian had eyes only for Flynn, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his blue eyes finding hers across the distance that separated them. The love and wonder in his gaze made her feel as though she were floating as she moved toward him, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Henderson's arm. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and sacred promises. Flynn's voice was steady as he vowed to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. Lillian's own vows came from the deepest part of her heart, a pledge to walk beside him through whatever joys and sorrows the future might hold. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, a perfect beginning to their life together. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, Lillian caught sight of her father in the back row, his eyes wet with tears but his expression one of genuine happiness for her. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a silent indication that the door to reconciliation remained open, should he choose to walk through it. The celebration afterward, held in the town hall decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, lasted well into the evening. There was dancing and laughter, good food and better company. Flynn never strayed far from Lillian's side, his hand frequently finding hers as if to reassure himself that this happiness was real. As the festivities wound down, Dr. Wilson raised his glass for a final toast. "To Flynn and Lillian Callahan," he called, his voice carrying across the hall. "May the key that brought you together unlock a lifetime of joy." The sentiment, so perfectly capturing their unique journey, brought tears to Lillian's eyes as she joined in the toast. Flynn's arm tightened around her waist and he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Callahan?" Home, the word held such promise. For now, home was a cozy two-room apartment above the Mercantile, rented until they could build on their land in the spring. But Lillian knew that home wasn't really about the building at all. It was about the man beside her, the love between them, the life they would create together. "Yes," she whispered back, "I'm ready." Later that night, as snow fell softly outside their window and the town of Silverridge slept peacefully below, Lillian lay in her husband's arms, contemplating the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Flynn asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. Lillian smiled up at him in the dim light. "I was thinking about keys and locks and how sometimes what seems like the worst moment of your life can actually be the door to something wonderful." Flynn nodded, understanding. "If your father hadn't locked you in that barn, and if you hadn't found the key," Lillian continued, "and never given it back," Flynn finished with a smile, reaching over to touch the silver charm that still hung at her throat. "Our children will think it's quite the romantic tale someday," Lillian mused. Flynn's eyes softened at the mention of children. "Our children," he repeated, as if testing the wonderful sound of the words. "I like that." "So do I," Lillian agreed, nestling closer into his embrace. Outside, the winter wind whispered secrets to the falling snow, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. But within the warm circle of Flynn's arms, Lillian knew she had found her true place in the world, not locked away as her father had once intended, but free to love and be loved, to dream and to build, to create a future limited only by the vastness of their shared imagination. The key that Flynn had found that summer day had unlocked far more than a barn door. It had unlocked a life, their life filled with possibilities neither of them could have foreseen when fate first brought them together on the Matthews ranch. And Flynn had been right never to give that key back. For in keeping it, he had given Lillian something far more precious, the certainty that some doors, once opened, would never be closed again.